Okay, it is now 2 minutes into the session. Good morning in North America for everyone. Thanks for joining. This is storytelling for policymakers. So let's go ahead and jump right in with a simple question. So why should we engage with policymakers in science? So for starters, if you look at the headlines, science and policy are already intertwined. If you look at issues like scientific integrity, federal science funding, and other science legislation, political appointees running scientific agencies, and other local science policy issues, this is really something that's already happening all around us. So I have some headlines from some events that have happened in the United States here, and I think this issue in particular has really risen to prominence during the COVID-19 pandemic this year. So it's also really up to scientists to make sure that science is on the radar of policymakers. So compared to many other topics, science just doesn't get talked about as a critical issue with policymakers very often. So in the United States, if you ever call your congressman's office, you'll have a staffer that will pick up. They typically have a sheet in front of them that shows some key issues that folks are calling in about. So that can be healthcare, social security, or education. And science isn't normally on that list. So it's really up to us as scientists in engaging with policymakers to make sure that that's something that's on their radar. So this is our third part in a 3-part Science Policy 101 series. In the first week of AGU fall meeting, we covered Science Policy 101, and last week we talked about messaging to policymakers. So a quick review, if you weren't able to attend those sessions, all of the sessions and from the whole meeting will be available in Confex through February 15th of next year. So you have plenty of time to go back and view those if you weren't able to make those sessions. So in Science Policy 101, we focused on a little bit more US centric. So if you're international and joining us today, go ahead and take a look at that, but it's going to be a little bit more US Congress focused. But we focused on Congress 101, so how bills become laws and some key science committees. We talked about the federal budget and appropriations in the United States, so how money gets controlled and spending gets controlled in the US. And then we covered some key science policy legislation. Last week in our messaging to policymakers, we reviewed what is an ask, how to research your policymakers, and how to craft your message. So today, we'll just take a quick moment to introduce ourselves. My name is Caitlin Bergstrom. I am the policy analyst on our public affairs staff here at AGU. Brittany and Cheyenne, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm the program manager for AGU's public affairs department.
Hi everyone, my name is Cheyenne and I'm the public affairs intern with AGU.
Great. Let's quickly go over our agenda for today. So we're going to start with talking about the basics of storytelling, then go into storytelling for advocacy, talk about how to craft your story, and then we'll do a debrief and a Q&A at the end, and then talk about some upcoming opportunities for everyone. So if anyone has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Throughout this session, we'll answer questions after each of our sessions and then have some more time at the end. So let's talk first about the basics of storytelling. So why should we tell stories? Why are stories important? Well, storytelling has been used as a language and as a way to communicate. It was a way for humans to communicate for millennia. Much of our history is passed down through storytelling, and nearly every culture has some version of storytelling that they do to share their culture and share their history. So let's talk a little bit more technically about how storytelling affects the brain. So storytelling helps improve memory. It establishes an emotional connection by releasing dopamine into the system, and it increases trust. Storytelling helps others see themselves in our work, and it really allows people to connect with us on a deeper level. So let's look at this sort of complicated index, but I'll walk through it with you all. So this is an index of social cognition, and it shows a range of good and bad social and intellectual scales. So at each extreme, you'll see at the top, you have good intellectual, at the bottom, you have bad intellectual. On the right, you have warm, which is good and social, and on the left, you have cold, which is bad and social. So you can see there are some sort of emotions tied to each of these indexes. And the scientific information typically falls at the high end of that good intellectual, which we see as very competent, but it isn't something that's seen as particularly warm. So the things that we see as warm and competent are reliable, practical, or important information. So let's sort of translate this into some occupational scales. So the warmest and the most competent professions are the ones that we trust the most. So those are teachers, nurses, and doctors. You can see that in that circled bubble sort of in the top left, or the top right, excuse me, of the screen here. Scientists fall somewhat in the middle of not too warm and not too cold. We're seen as about as competent as lawyers say, but a little bit more warm. But in order to increase our perceived trust, we really want to be perceived as warmer. So we can increase that by telling stories. So let's go over sort of what a basic story arc looks like. My colleague Olivia drew these great graphics, and we'll walk through what's in a story. So a story begins with an exposition. So this is your once upon a time when I was a kid. It's really setting up the very opening parts of the introduction of your story. We then move into an inciting incident. So this is when a conflict happens. So a dragon came, a disease hit, or a need arose. So this is really sort of the pivotal part when the action starts to kick up in your story, which we then move into your rising action. So this is, you're traveling to the Emerald City, you're meeting the Great and Terrible Oz and the Wizard of Oz here, you're fighting all the flying monkeys. So the rising action includes obstacle after obstacle after obstacle until you reach the climax of your story. So this is really the high point. You've slain the dragon, you have solved the mystery, you cured this mystery disease. I feel like we're sort of in the climax of COVID-19 right now. So this is really the high point and the turning point in your story before you come to your falling action. So this is your friends getting your gifts. This is sort of wrapping up some of the loose ends. This is kind of, I think in a story, I see this as sort of the like feel good tying up loose ends. It's very satisfying here. And it ends with your resolution. So clicking your heels, there's no place like home. So I think in stories, an ending can be kind of tricky, especially in some of the storytelling we'll talk about. So it's important in a story to have that resolution and to have that ending. Nobody likes a never-ending story, and we really want to make sure that we are wrapping things up, you're bringing things home. So if we're talking about the kind of storytelling we're doing, it's really good to end your story with sort of like a lesson or why this is important. So thinking about what you're asked if you were in the workshop last week with the messaging for policymakers, including your ask at the end of your story. So here's everything that we had, and this is why my ask is important or critical in this way. So before Brittany talks more about storytelling specifically to policymakers, let's talk a little bit about kinds of stories. So there are many different kinds of stories. So we have mysteries, we have thrillers and personal stories, but personal stories are ones that really stick with your audience. And these are the best for the kind of connection that we're really trying to foster. So sharing either your personal story. So we have Rachel Carson's Silent Spring on here. This is a really classic environmental text that I think a lot of environmental students in at least the US read about pollutants in agriculture and how it affected public health. But you even have just newspaper headlines here, so talking about wildfires and other extreme weather costs to the nation, so many lives and so much money in this year. So being able to, again, put your personal story forward or really bring a human-focused element to your storytelling is a really good way to bring your work really to your audience and make it the most accessible. So any questions here before I pass it over to Brittany to talk about storytelling for policymakers? Go ahead and drop them in the chat if you have them, or yeah. Great, I will let you all mull over that, and then if you have any questions along the way, feel free to drop them in and I'll pass it over to Brittany.
Still on mute. Thanks, Caitlin. I'd like to start with this quote. Data makes you credible, stories make you memorable. When meeting with legislators or policymakers, it's not always enough to be credible. You need to be memorable as well. Often policymakers and their staff might have over 10 meetings a day, and they're often on a wide variety of topics. So they might be jumping from a meeting about tax policy to COVID-19 to talking about earthquakes. So telling a good story that sticks with the policymaker or their staff can really be key to staying on their radar. So in addition to the storytelling elements that Caitlin went over, here are some additional elements that make a story suitable for policymakers. Representative, not extreme. It needs to be relevant to the policymaker and their district or their district. You need your story to connect to policy. You want your story to cause an emotional reaction. You want it to be paired with the call to action. So as Caitlin mentioned, kind of it goes along with your ask. I'm going to cover each of these elements in detail, but one way to think about these is to really perhaps craft a story that you want to share with policymakers and then use this list as a checklist almost. So does your story also meet all of these elements in addition to being a story? So the first element of an advocacy story is that it should be representative, not extreme. By that, your story should be representative of broader concerns or problems within your community. Your policymakers represent hundreds, thousands, or millions of people, but they also have limited bandwidth. So they'll be more motivated and more likely to act if they know they're helping a broad swath of their constituents. And I encourage you to think broadly when identifying your community. It could be the international community of seismologists that you belong to, or it could be your university, or it could be your actual town community. And secondly, you want your story to be relevant to your policymaker or your district. And this element really builds off of that first element. So not only should your story represent a broader issue within your community, but it should also touch upon the challenges it causes for different people in your community. And you might also want to think about how might you relate your challenge or problem to a universal kind of theme or challenge, like lack of time or money, health concerns, or access to opportunity. These are challenges that any audience and any policymaker might be able to relate to, even if they can't relate to your specific challenge. Thirdly, because your audience is policymakers, your story should connect to policy. Your story should point to a problem or issue that can be addressed by policymakers through policy or legislative means. So for instance, because federal legislators oversee federal agencies, maybe it's an issue with a federal agency that you want them to address, but it really needs to connect to policy in some way. And often thinking about your problem in a broader sense is how you can kind of connect it to policy. Fourth, your story should invoke an emotional reaction in your audience. Based on research from a couple of years ago, here are the 27 categories of emotion that humans have. Once you've drafted your story, I encourage you to reflect both on what emotion do you want your story to invoke and what emotion does it actually invoke in your audience. Depending on your call to action or the purpose of your story, you'll want to invoke different emotions. But you'll notice there are probably a couple of emotions that you want to avoid, like awkwardness or boredom or confusion in your story. So, and I'm going to finally say that your story should be called with a call to action. So, what's your ask? Kind of as a result of your story, what do you want your policymaker to do? Similar to perhaps the moral or a fable kind of a story, a moral of a fable, your advocacy story should end with the issue or problem facing your community and how that can be solved or mitigated through a legislative or policy fix. And so, I mean, basically, you're kind of asking yourself what policy or legislative fix could create a better future for your community. And maybe that's related to funding or legislation or joining a caucus. And I would say go back and look at our messaging to policymakers for more details about each of these asks. And so that's all I have. And so happy to take some questions about this now that we've talked about both storytelling and kind of advocacy for storytelling. Okay, seeing no questions, but keep thinking about your questions because we'll have time at the end for sure to talk about them. I'd like to turn it over to Cheyenne now to give us some great examples.
Awesome. Thank you, Brittany. So first off, today we're going to discuss the story of an activist and a scientist who use their own personal experiences to affect policy change. And I first want to start off with Hazel M. Johnson. She's also known as the mother of environmental justice. And you may or may not know her story, but she's an advocate for low-income communities of color who were disproportionately affected by environmental hazards. Next slide, please. So her journey first began after watching a TV program in 1971. She learned her community, Algett Gardens, had the highest incident of cancer in Chicago. Her husband that year had previously died of cancer, and then later 4 young girls had died of cancer. She attributed this to the community being built on a former factory lot. Next slide. So as you can see here, she's had a long advocacy journey, and it first started off by conducting an informal survey with her community members, just simply asking whether or not they themselves had suffered from cancer or they knew someone that suffered from cancer. And the results were pretty shocking. She then later teamed up with a young activist you might know, Barack Obama. She worked with him to bring awareness to the asbestos infestation of the community to the Chicago Housing Authority. And after that, she formed the People for Community Recovery's organization, where she later advocated for repairs in her community. Then she teamed up with the University of Illinois to conduct a formal survey on public health hazards in her community, and she presented those results to the Illinois State EPA office. Next slide. She continued her advocacy journey for decades. In 1993, she testified before Congress, and the following year, she worked to have President Bill Clinton sign an executive order on environmental justice. Her specific ask and her story made government agencies and officials take action. But next, we're going to start talking about a different story of advocacy, but one that still had great impact. So climate scientist Steve Gahn didn't really believe scientists should be advocates. He believed their place was in the research lab. But over the last few years, that's quickly changed. He's kind of realized policymakers, they may not make the necessary changes or they may need scientific advice. So he decided to trek 1,500 miles of the Pacific Crest Trail, where he brought along with him a bright blue hat with the 4 words, "Make Earth Cool Again" on the front. And along the trail, people would stop him and ask, "What's on your hat?" or "What's your hat about?" And he would tell them, "I'm a climate scientist, this is my research." And then he would talk to them about the current state of climate change. After receiving so many positive reactions, he decided to continue his advocacy work with Citizens Climate Lobby. This took him on the Water, Wind, and Fire tour, where he toured all along Eastern Washington and Northern Idaho, holding 31 local events on climate advocacy, which resulted in huge impact with over 400 letters being written to US representatives asking them to take climate action. Hazel Johnson and Steve Gahn developed their stories and a deep connection with policymakers to affect national policy change and work on advocacy. I hope their stories inspired you, and now I'll turn it back over to Brittany.
Thanks, Cheyenne. So I just dropped some handouts in the chat that will help you craft your own story. And I'll go over them in just a second, but I just want to mention that this is definitely storytelling for policymakers. This is definitely kind of advanced advocacy, if you will, and it's going to require practice. You know, I think if any of you have participated or been to an event like Story Collider or listened to like the Moth podcast where people tell stories, it's definitely a skill, and people hone their stories, you know, to make sure they're saying like exactly the right word at exactly the right moment that really gets the reaction from the audience that they want. So this is going to require some practice, but the handouts we provided, I hope they'll help you think about storytelling for science. And I'll also mention, we didn't share them today, but there's lots of science behind the art of storytelling as well, and just a tool and storytelling as a tool for science communication. So the first handout I dropped in the chat is from our AGU Sharing Science program, and it mirrors a lot of what Caitlin was talking about in terms of, I believe it's called Freytag's Pyramid, and will help you craft your story that way. The second handout I shared with you all is really some themes for you to think about as you're telling your science story. Science actually goes really well with a lot of like kind of universal themes, like the quest or journey. You know, if you're going on a field experiment or a field experience, or perhaps it's your journey, kind of a coming of age story about how you became a scientist. So there's lots of themes that you can really pick from that I think work really well with science, but there are many more themes. These are just kind of some more obvious ones. So I shared both kind of the Pixar method that I think we're all familiar with, but also a really interesting method that's developed by Randy Olson, which is kind of the and, but, therefore. And this is really for those of you who really want to make yourself, I think this works really well for people who want to make themselves a resource for their congressional offices or policymakers. I think this model works really well. So I see a question in the chat and talking about, I'm sorry, Carol, I don't know when the messaging policymakers will be finished archiving, but I think they've been about kind of like a week behind. So I would say probably sometime next week. And then we have a question, is a Microsoft PowerPoint an appropriate tool for storytelling? And I'll take a first stab at this, but if other people want to say things or want to offer comments as well, I would just say definitely yes. I actually saw a very cool poster where someone kind of put, they had a geographic map of California, and they were kind of telling a story about water in California, but they kind of imprinted or overlaid the story onto the map of California. And so I think having visual clues like that really helps to tell a story. I will say in a congressional office, I think pulling out a PowerPoint is a little hard, but perhaps having it on a one-pager might be possible. Yeah, and we're pretty much done with our formal presentation today. So we're really happy to take some additional questions, and I can definitely drop in these worksheets once again into the chat.
Yeah, if folks want to look at those worksheets and then ask any questions that they might have for the worksheets, please, we're here. Feel free to do this or feel free to do that. I did drop in for Carol the messaging to policymakers conflicts link. So with your login, you should be able to see that. And on our Bridge blog, if you missed any of our science policy sessions, we have the conflicts links in the on our blog there, and you can see most of the sessions up now. Great. Thanks, Carol. Sorry, I thought it was up. I like saw my face in the corner in a video.
So Laura asked, do we have any examples of one-pagers online that we can view that are excellent examples of stories and an ask? You know, I really can't think of any, but Laura, I will say, Laura's one of our amazing Voices for Science people I'll mention, which is a program I'll mention again at the end. So I'll definitely share that resource. But Laura, I'll email you if there was, I'll email you the poster session that I'm talking about. I can't recall the name right now, sadly, but it was a really great example of people using visualizations to tell their story. So we have another, oh, this is a really interesting question from Liz. What do you think about helping the policymaker be a part of your story? So kind of making the policymaker making the policymaker the hero of your story through your call to action. That's a really interesting question, Liz. You know, I have to say, I don't think I've seen that quite done before, but I really like that idea and I'm really intrigued. Because, you know, what we talk a lot about in our messaging to policymakers workshop is, one, if you go to a congressional meeting, it's great to have, well, if you go to a congressional meeting, it's great to make your ask seem like a win-win request for the office. And so I kind of feel like putting the policymaker at the center of your story leads to that. Basically, you've made it a win-win request. So I love that idea, Liz. So as we're talking, I'd love to hear if other people are doing storytelling science comm already, but maybe haven't done in the policy sphere, or if any of you have done storytelling with your policymakers to make your ask. I'd love to hear about that as well if you want to drop your experiences in the chat. Okay. So I think with that, please feel free to drop your questions. Oh, we have a question now. Is narrative writing more relevant to science/research than storytelling, or is there a difference? Madood, if I'm saying your name, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name.
No, you're absolutely fine.
Yeah, do you want to unmute? Yeah, I was gonna say, do you want to just ask your question? I'm not sure I'm getting it.
Well, because in narrative writing is when you turn the story into information and insights, right? There is, because so I'll give you an example. When we are doing explaining a research mission or a satellite mission, the purpose of the information is this is the physical variable like temperature that we want to measure from space, and this is how we're going to measure it. But when we will measure it, we will allow to issue heat advisories that would save lives of the elderly and the vulnerable, right? So we have to capture all of those pieces in a narrative, in a story. And so what I think what a PowerPoint does, and that was my first question, because PowerPoint says bullets, it doesn't allow a narration of a story. And you have to be really skillful if you have pictures and you can speak to it. Most scientists generally speak through the bullets. And so they are not able to convey a sort of a story about why is it needed, how will it save lives, and that emotional connection. So I was just wondering if if I were to advocate that NASA should get rid of PowerPoint, I mean, God forbid, but if I said that, what other tool is available for people to tell a story about a satellite mission?
Caitlin, I'll let you.
So I was gonna say, I think I know a lot of people that work like specifically in the strategic communications space that would say they would advocate for not using PowerPoint anymore, because if you're using PowerPoint to just, most people when they use a PowerPoint put too many words on the PowerPoint and it's distracting to the audience because all they do is just read the PowerPoint. But I think if you're using it for something like visuals, like sort of what you're talking about, that's like maybe a little bit like data that's a little bit more complex. I think that the utility of it is having sort of like a visual element to your storytelling, but I think practiced storytellers might not always need that. And I think it's being able to, like I talked about in my segment, sort of like tie more of this human element to it, or we talked about this a little bit more in the messaging workshop, but being able to like make things, like talk about things in as plain of terms as possible, and like to make something more accessible to an audience. Because I think if you're just throwing graphs up and then saying like, well, let me explain this whole thing, that's not really good storytelling. But if you use it as a complement and not a crutch, I guess that's my
yeah, I mean,
my
it's
advice.
something that I think all science agencies struggle with because
Yes.
we want to be able to connect, and the implications of that, and we have a very hard time doing that. And I do a lot of presentations for senior executives, and trust me, the words are needed because you want to leave them with something, because it's sort of, science is sometimes counterintuitive, it doesn't register, so it's a struggle. So AGUs, thank you so much for the session, but I think if it would be more this real direct challenge of how to communicate this information in a narrative, that would be really helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's good feedback. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else to add, Brittany?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think the audience that we focus on, and I would say the audience that we have expertise is dealing with policymakers. But I will also say that check out the Sharing Science program. I'm not sure if they did it this year, but they've done like a filmmaking and storytelling. I think they had someone come in and talk about like doing animations. So we're specifically talking about a very specific audience here. But I think if you're talking about narratives in general, I think our Sharing Science folks will definitely have more resources. And I'll just say are definitely the experts on this front, because they also study not just how to do it, but also kind of the science behind some of these things, which we tend not to touch upon. And so, can you write policy briefs as a story, or should those be strictly factual? My feeling on this is that I've seen people, this can kind of sometimes be, I don't want to say hokey, but I think in written materials, some like what you're talking about, I've seen sometimes people kind of like spotlight stories of like how a particular person might be impacted. So if you're talking about, let's say extreme heat, maybe telling like one story about someone impacted by extreme heat and then having a more factual policy brief. I just think you have to be careful about that. But I would say in a lot of policy reports, I've seen them now kind of call out specific examples. And I think a good example of this actually is, Carol, I would encourage you to check out our Surging Waters report, because we talk about the issue of flooding in different regions in the US, but then we also spotlight specific community stories about flooding and kind of how scientists and communities are working together to face that challenge. So I think that would be a great example for you. And then we have go ahead, Caitlin.
I was gonna drop the Sharing Science report in the chat here. But yeah, I think that's spot on. I think if you're exactly what Brittany said. If you have, if you're able to include some personal stories in something like a policy brief, that's good. But I think something strict like a policy brief should, it doesn't need to be rigid, but yeah, I think it's important to not make it hokey. So the PDF to that Surging Waters report, which I co-authored last year with AGU, yeah, we tried to bring a lot of storytelling elements into this, and it has sections on lots of different kinds of flooding. So feel free to reach out to us if you have questions about sort of that as a policy brief. I'm gonna go to the next question. Thank you for sharing the story of a woman of color who brought policy change through her actions and storytelling. How often does this happen? Is there a disparity in how people of color or non-majority citizens are able to tell their stories, their communities, or their research or program activity themselves directly to policymakers in the US? Brittany or Cheyenne, I'm not from, I'm sure that there is a disparity in that. I don't have a number behind that, but I don't know if Cheyenne or Brittany wants to jump in there.
I can just speak about a recent example that I worked on with my graduate program. There's a PFOS, PFO contamination in Newburgh, New York, and I am an MS candidate at Bard College, and we're working with the citizens there on increasing stakeholder engagement because the community there is so diverse. You have people of Creole descent all over from Latin America, Haiti as well. And the biggest issue we were running into was there was a lack of communication or a disparity in communication because they weren't printing material informing the public in their different languages. It was a lot of health programs being printed out in English. So half of the or majority of the community isn't going to know what's actually happening with the update. When are the hearings going to be to discuss this, or community meetings? Also, a lot of POC in the area, they had to work a lot. And the times the meetings were in the middle of the day, or they'd be held at one of the universities that they have never been to before. So it's like there was a lack of communication, a lack of consideration for overall their schedules, their family and time commitments. And those are just a couple of examples of the disparities and kind of these environmental health hazard issues or just environmental justice issues as well. And so we're working with local representatives there and then a couple of the local churches to start better communication efforts, printing material such as getting your blood tested. Now that's being printed in Creole and Spanish. So those options are there. And as they're going to start printing it in French as well for the immigrants coming from Haiti. So that's just a prime example of some of the disparities. And then I think now we're starting to see some women of color really rise up in the activism movement. Not that they haven't been there, it's just now the spotlight is finally on them. I think a prime example is Miss Flint, Mari Copney. She's a great example. I'm blanking on some names right now, but there's a great activist. She's also really young. She's 16. I believe she's from Minnesota. She's just taken on a great youth movement, working, I know, with AOC to talk about what's happening in climate change. So there's definitely a spotlight coming in on women of color working in the activism movement and just advocating for environmental justice issues. But that's a little bit of the knowledge I have on the topic.
Are you talking about Representative Ilhan Omar's daughter?
She's also really big. I'm just blanking on the other name right now, but she also works with Representative Omar's daughter. But two great examples.
The youth will save us.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think Cheyenne hit on a lot of the specifics, but I think it's just lack of access. And I think perhaps, I don't know if ironically is the word, I think now that a lot of things have been forced to move virtual, I think it's actually the lack of access to our federal policymakers might actually be less right now. Because I think previously, it would almost be unheard of for a policymaker or their staff to jump on Zoom or jump on phone calls with constituents. They'd really be expecting them to come to DC in the office or to meet with them when they're in the district. So I definitely think lack of access, and honestly, the lack of access is not just for people of color, it's also kind of a socioeconomic issue. You know, who can afford to come or who can afford to come to DC or belong to organizations that will pay for you to come to DC. I think that's the largest one. And then I want to make sure I'm addressing all of your question. But, you know, I would say, I don't know if there's a disparity in how people can tell their stories, but I think that sometimes there's a disparity in people being able to relate to people of color stories, which I think as Congress becomes more diverse, that's less of a problem. But you know, I think that's just a general problem in our country, to be quite honest with you. Just to be quite honest. But yeah, I agree. Definitely looking forward to seeing, I think, a more diverse SciComm and Sci-policy and science advocate community as well.
Yeah,
so
I think too, I think too, to like both what Brittany and Cheyenne were saying of like a lot of the youth movement and moving things virtual, I am like amazed at what these kids can do on TikTok. I'm like 28, I feel like ancient. But I think that moving everything online does make a lot of these avenues so much more accessible to a broad swath of people. And I think it allows people to get really creative with their storytelling. So I don't know a ton about TikTok, but I know that there's a lot that happens on there. And there's like, there was a piece in the Times the other week talking about activism on TikTok specifically. So I think we're at the point now where obviously like here we're talking, you're not gonna reach a policymaker through TikTok. I don't even know if AOC is really on TikTok, but I think there is this like really good opportunity to sort of innovate the way that we tell stories, because we can reach so many different kinds of audiences in so many different ways now that we're all on our phones and computers 20 hours a day.
Thanks, Caitlin. And so question from Susan, what would be your recommendations for stories that might be able to communicate the scale of the need for unprecedented, transformative, urgent policy to address the scale of the climate crisis? That's a big question. I would actually say, you know, I kind of like defer to the giants on this one. I think Catherine Hayhoe has a lot on this, and she spoke at a session the other night kind of just about this topic, and she's phenomenal. But I would also say there's a lot of like actually really good reporting on this issue as well. I'm thinking about like the New York Times, I think the Washington Post recently had this. But I think one, in some ways you have to, I don't think you can frame it as unprecedented, because then I think people just get overwhelmed really easily. I think unfortunately that's one part of it. I think because I think to get people on board with, I think to get people on, I want to say to get people on board, I know we need transformative change, like I'm not disputing that at all, but I think it's easy for people to get overwhelmed, especially in the world we live in right now, where everything is unprecedented and it seems like we're jumping from crisis to crisis perhaps. But another thing I'm just thinking, you know, when you're talking to policymakers specifically, I think you make it very specific to them. You talk about the changes that are happening to their constituents, in their community, to their economies. So it's in many ways, it's localizing it, I think is the most important thing, because I think that's what people can kind of wrap their minds around, if you will. I think if you talk about the changes happening if you get too large, I think you lose people a little bit. But I think if you talk about what are we seeing in our community, and you make it very specific and localized, because I think on a lot of specific and local regions, you know, we're seeing like historic flooding or like wildfires. Those are things that people that feel a little bit more real to people. So those are kind of my suggestions. But I would say, I know there's a lot of good resources out there. I can't put my finger on any one good resources, but I would kind of say look to climate scientists out there who you kind of like their approach, and I would say kind of look to them as an example. But when talking to policymakers, I think localizing thing is the most important part. I think that's how you get people on board.
Yeah, I think.
Oh, go ahead, Caitlin.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So I also would recommend Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson or Dr. Kate Marvel. They both, I think, do very inspiring climate work along with Catherine Hayhoe. But I think just like a climate scientist, like there isn't one kind of climate scientist. There are so many different kinds of climate science and climate science and climate scientists, and there are so many different solutions. So I think sort of picking your lane of like what the solution you care the most about is and like what you want to advocate to your policymaker, or maybe a small handful of things is the best way to do that, because there are so many different things that we need to do to address the climate crisis, that you can't, not every single person can do every single one of those things, and not every policymaker can tackle all of those things. And I think too, especially now, this is a really good time. I don't know the right word to use this, but we're going to have to rebuild the economy in the United States after this pandemic. And I think that there is a big push, and can be more of a push, to incorporate some changes, some of these transformative changes that we need to make as we're rebuilding the economy after this one unprecedented crisis, to help mitigate the impacts of this new unprecedented crisis. So I hope that that is helpful.
So Sid asked a question, you know, are there ways to craft stories that cut through political partisanship? My understanding of US climate policy is that it's not always been partisan, but it's definitely become so over time. And could storytelling be used as a tool for unification? If so, how? So this is actually something we talked about. I think the thing that came to mind as Caitlin was talking about is something we talked about in our messaging to policymakers workshop. You know, when Obama was rolling out his Clean Power Plan, and they had to have states buy into it, basically, like the states had to agree to take action. And I think the stories they told were really around kids and how cleaner air would help kids. So I think, you know, stories are universal. So I think there are some universal, I think you can play up the universality of stories, I think, in a really effective way to kind of bridge these partisan divides, because there are definitely, you know, telling a story about a kid or telling a story about a community in trouble. I think, you know, if you can tell a good story that really gets down to one of these universal themes, I think you could use, I think you can use it to make any issue, I guess, nonpartisan. So I definitely think storytelling and kind of climate science communication can definitely go hand in hand, because, you know, the climate crisis is happening to all of us, but all of us know stories, and we inherently recognize when we're being told a story. And also too, you can think about using storytelling to invoke the kind of emotions you want to invoke. I think it's just a matter of crafting a story. It's just a matter of kind of crafting and honing that story. Caitlin or Cheyenne, I don't know if you want to add more to that. Yeah, Sid, I hope that's helpful. I'm like, I don't know what the story looks like, but you know, I think about what are those things that, okay, you said it was very helpful. I'll stop talking.
Yeah, but I think again, and obviously we talked about this today, we talked about this in the messaging workshop, but really sort of tying to a human element as much as possible, I think is a really good way to get people's attention. Yeah, and thank you for sharing How to Save a Planet, Alex. I love this podcast. I listened to all of it on an 8-hour drive earlier this year, and I think they cover a lot of really good, really great, and a broad swath of topics. Yeah, these are all really great questions, and thank you everyone for sticking around to hear what everybody has to say. Yeah, if anybody has resources like this, please keep sharing them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today and for sticking around. Really enjoyed the Q&A. I feel like this is the first time it's felt very much like one of our normal in-person workshops for sure.
Yes.
And so, Stephen, if we could go back to sharing the slides, that would be wonderful. Thanks. So just want to emphasize again, please, if you missed out on the first two part of the series, Science Policy 101 and Messaging to Policymakers, but we also had lots of other policy events ranging from science policy around the world, to one about how to build a sharing science or build a science policy community, to informational sessions about some of our current opportunities. If we could click to the next one. Yeah, so a couple of exciting opportunities for you all who might be more interested or want to get more involved with science policy is you can apply to work for Congress for 1 year as part of our Congressional Science Fellowship. The application is currently open, and we had a session on this, I believe, the first week of this meeting entitled How to Become a Congressional Science Fellowship, if you want to know more about that. But you could also join our community of exceptional science policy advocates, which I see a couple on here today. And they can tell you how wonderful the program is. And our Voices for Science program, we have both a science communication and a science policy track. And we kind of challenge our Voices for Science people to take at least one science policy, science communication, or science outreach activity a month. We start with a wonderful kickoff workshop, and then you'll have monthly meetings with your AGU liaison, and also just kind of like an AGU liaison staff contact to touch base with anytime. But also, we advertise all of these events through our Science Policy Alerts, which is our monthly newsletter. And you can actually text AGU to 52886 and you'll get signed up for that. And that's how we advertise all of our opportunities, both big, like joining the Voices for Science Fellowship, joining the Voices for Science program, or becoming a Congressional Science Fellowship, but also monthly small actions like writing your legislator about science funding or COVID-19 relief, or more kind of in the moment policy developments. And also right now we are advertising for our winter intern. So you can be the next Cheyenne or Stephen. It's a 3-month paid internship and it's going to be virtual this winter, given COVID. And with that, we'll click to the next slide and please keep in touch with us. You can follow us on Twitter or you can email us or check out our website. We are here for our AGU members. And happy to talk anytime. And yes, I can, I will put our contact information in the chat.